Rebecca Martinez stood in line at the small courthouse in Millbrook County, clutching a crumpled traffic ticket in her sweaty palm. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting harsh shadows on the worn linoleum floor. She'd never been in trouble before, never even had a parking ticket, and the whole experience made her stomach churn with anxiety. The ticket was for speeding, supposedly going 45 in a 30 zone while driving through the construction area on Maple Street. But Rebecca knew she hadn't been speeding. She remembered that day clearly because her elderly neighbor Mrs. Chen had called. Panicked about her cat being stuck in a tree, Rebecca had driven carefully through the construction zone, worried about getting to help in time but definitely not speeding. "Next," barked the clerk behind the bulletproof glass. Rebecca approached the window, her hands trembling slightly. "Hi, I'm here about this traffic ticket. I'd like to contest it because I wasn't actually speeding." The clerk, a woman with frizzy gray hair and thick glasses, barely looked up from her computer screen. "Court date is next Tuesday at 9 a.m. Judge Williamson presiding. You'll need to fill out this form." She slid a piece of paper through the slot with all the enthusiasm of someone processing their 1,000th identical request. "But I have evidence," Rebecca said quickly. "My car has this safety feature that records my speed, and I can prove I wasn't going more than 32 miles per hour." The clerk finally looked up, her expression suggesting Rebecca had just claimed she could fly. "Tell it to the judge, honey. Next." Rebecca stepped aside, feeling dismissed and frustrated. She filled out the form with shaking hands, double-checking every detail. This was also foreign to her world of teaching 3rd grade and volunteering at the animal shelter. She'd lived in Millbrook County her whole life, keeping to herself, following every rule, and now she felt like she was being treated like a criminal over something she didn't even do. The following Tuesday arrived gray and drizzly. Rebecca had barely slept, going over her evidence again and again. She'd printed out the speed data from her car's computer system, taken photos of the construction zone, and even researched traffic laws online until her eyes burned. The courtroom was smaller than she'd expected, with dark wood paneling and fluorescent lights that flickered intermittently. About a dozen other people sat on hard wooden benches, most looking as nervous as she felt. Some whispered to each other, others stared at their phones, and a few appeared to be regulars who knew the routine. Judge Williamson entered through a side door, and Rebecca's heart sank immediately. He was a tall, thin man in his 60s with gray hair slicked back and small, cold eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses. His black robe seemed to make him loom larger as he took his seat behind the imposing wooden bench. Everything about his demeanor screamed authority and impatience. "All rise for the Honorable Judge Williamson," called the bailiff. The judge's voice was sharp and clipped as he began calling cases. Rebecca watched case after case get processed with mechanical efficiency. Person after person approached the defendant's table, most pleading guilty and accepting fines, a few trying to explain their situations only to be cut off with dismissive waves. "Traffic violation. Rebecca Martinez," the clerk called out. Rebecca's legs felt like jelly as she walked to the small table facing the judge. She placed her folder of evidence carefully in front of her and tried to stand straight, despite her racing heart. Judge Williamson didn't look up from the papers in front of him. "Mrs. Martinez, you're charged with exceeding the posted speed limit in a construction zone. How do you plead?" "Not guilty, Your Honor. I have evidence that shows I wasn't speeding." Now the judge looked up and Rebecca immediately regretted speaking. His eyes were cold and calculating, and something about his expression suggested he'd already decided her fate before she'd even walked into the room. "Evidence?" He said the word like it tasted bad. "What kind of evidence could you possibly have that contradicts the trained officer who issued this citation?" Rebecca's voice came out smaller than she'd intended. "My car has a computer system that records speed data, and it shows I was only going 32 miles per hour in the construction zone. I also have photos of the area showing the speed limit signs." "Young lady," Judge Williamson said, his voice dripping with condescension, "do you really think your little car computer is more reliable than our certified police radar equipment?" "Well, yes, Your Honor, because the data shows—" "I didn't ask for a technical explanation," he snapped. "Officer Bradley, please approach the bench." A police officer who'd been sitting in the back of the courtroom walked forward. He was a heavy-set man with a mustache who moved with the confidence of someone who'd testified in this courtroom hundreds of times. "Officer Bradley," Judge Williamson said with a warm smile that hadn't been present when he was speaking to Rebecca. Please tell the court about the traffic stop in question. Certainly, Your Honor. I was monitoring traffic in the construction zone on Maple Street when I observed the defendant's vehicle traveling at approximately 45 miles per hour in a posted 30-mile-per-hour zone. I immediately initiated a traffic stop and issued the appropriate citation. Rebecca felt her cheeks burn. Excuse me, Your Honor, but that's not accurate. I have the speed data right here, and I can show you. Mrs. Martinez. Judge Williamson's voice boomed through the small courtroom. You will speak when spoken to. This is my courtroom, and you will show proper respect. The other people in the courtroom shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Rebecca felt tears prick at her eyes, but she blinked them back. She'd never been spoken to like this in her life. Never been made to feel so small and powerless. Now then, the judge continued, his tone returning to the friendly warmth he'd used with the officer. Officer Bradley, in your professional opinion, how confident are you in your radar reading? Completely confident, Your Honor. The equipment was calibrated that morning, and I've been using radar equipment for over 15 years. Judge Williamson nodded approvingly. And Mrs. Martinez's claims about her car's computer system? Officer Bradley shrugged. I've heard people make all sorts of claims about their speedometers and car computers. They're not calibrated for law enforcement purposes, and aren't admissible as evidence in traffic cases. That's not true, Rebecca burst out, unable to contain herself any longer. I researched this, and car computer data is admissible evidence in traffic cases. There are precedents. Enough! Judge Williamson slammed his gavel so hard that several people in the courtroom jumped. Mrs. Martinez, you are dangerously close to contempt of court. I suggest you remember where you are and who you're speaking to. Rebecca's hands were shaking now, not from nervousness but from anger and frustration. She could see exactly what was happening here. This judge had already made up his mind, probably before she'd even walked into the room. The friendly banter with the police officer, the dismissive attitude toward her evidence, the aggressive reaction to her attempts to defend herself, it was all part of a system designed to steamroll people like her. Your Honor, she said, trying to keep her voice steady. I just want to present my evidence. I have documentation that proves I wasn't speeding, and I have the right to defend myself. Judge Williamson leaned back in his chair, a thin smile playing at his lips. Mrs. Martinez, let me explain something to you. This is not some television courtroom drama. This is the real world, where real consequences apply to people who think they can waste the court's time with frivolous defenses. He paused, seeming to enjoy the moment. I find you guilty of exceeding the posted speed limit. The fine is $450 plus court costs of $75. You have 30 days to pay. The words hit Rebecca like a physical blow. $525 was more than she spent on groceries in 2 months. As a teacher, every dollar mattered, and this felt like highway robbery. But it wasn't just about the money. It was about the injustice of it all. The way she'd been treated like her word meant nothing, like she was some kind of nuisance to be swept aside. Her whole life she'd believed that truth mattered, that evidence mattered, that the system would protect people who followed the rules and told the truth. Standing there in that courthouse, watching Judge Williamson already moving on to the next case like she'd never existed, Rebecca realized she'd been naive about how the world really worked. She was about to learn it worked very differently when you knew the right people. Rebecca stood frozen at the defendant's table, staring at Judge Williamson as he shuffled through papers for the next case. The sound of his gavel still echoed in her ears, along with the crushing weight of the unfair judgment. $525 for something she didn't do. Dismissed without even looking at her evidence. Next case, Judge Williamson called out, not even glancing in her direction. The bailiff gestured for Rebecca to move along, but she remained rooted to the spot. Everything inside her screamed against walking away quietly. She'd spent weeks preparing, had solid proof of her innocence, and this judge hadn't even bothered to look at it. Your Honor, she said, her voice stronger now despite the trembling in her hands, I respectfully request that you examine my evidence before finalizing this judgment. Judge Williamson's head snapped up, his eyes arrowing dangerously. The entire courtroom fell silent, sensing the tension crackling between them. Mrs. Martinez, I have already rendered my decision. You need to step away from my courtroom immediately or I will hold you in contempt. But you haven't looked at any of my evidence, Rebecca pressed on. The speed data from my car's computer clearly shows bailiff, Judge Williamson barked. If Mrs. Martinez says one more word, arrest her for contempt of court. The bailiff, a large man with kind eyes who looked uncomfortable with the situation, stepped closer to Rebecca. She could see the apology in his expression, but also the warning. This judge meant business. Rebecca gathered her folder of useless evidence and walked toward the courtroom exit, her face burning with humiliation. Behind her, she could hear Judge Williamson's voice return to its normal tone as he addressed the next defendant, a young man with multiple parking violations who was treated with more respect than she had been. Outside the courthouse, Rebecca sat in her car for 20 minutes just trying to process what had happened. She'd lived her entire adult life believing that the justice system worked, that truth and evidence mattered. The reality of what she'd just experienced felt like a betrayal of everything she'd been taught to believe about fairness and the rule of law. Her phone buzzed with a text from her husband. How did it go? Call me when you're done. Rebecca stared at the message, not sure how to even begin explaining what had just happened. David was currently in Washington for work. He'd been traveling more frequently lately for his job. She'd handled this whole traffic ticket situation alone because she thought it would be simple, straightforward. She never imagined she'd need backup for something so basic. Instead of calling, she drove to the county clerk's office. If Judge Williamson wouldn't listen to reason in his courtroom, maybe she could appeal the decision through proper channels. She'd always been the type of person who followed rules and procedures, and surely there had to be a process for addressing judicial misconduct. The clerk's office was in the same building as the courthouse, down a hallway lined with faded photographs of county officials dating back decades. Rebecca found herself studying the pictures of past judges, wondering if any of them had treated citizens with such obvious disdain. "Can I help you?" asked a young woman behind the counter. Unlike the court clerk, this one seemed genuinely interested in helping. "I just had a hearing with Judge Williamson and I'd like to file an appeal." He refused to look at evidence that would have proven my innocence. The young woman's expression immediately shifted, becoming more guarded. "An appeal for a traffic violation?" "Yes. I have documented proof that I wasn't speeding, but the judge wouldn't even examine it. He was also extremely rude and threatening." The clerk glanced around nervously before leaning closer. "Ma'am, I probably shouldn't say this, but Judge Williamson has a reputation. Appeals for traffic cases are rare and expensive, usually more than the fine itself. Most people just pay and move on." "What do you mean he has a reputation?" "Look, I could lose my job for saying this, but that man has been on the bench for 12 years, and he runs his courtroom like his personal kingdom. He's buddies with most of the police department, owns several businesses in town, and his family has connections everywhere. People have tried to complain before, but nothing ever sticks." Rebecca felt her anger growing. "So he just gets away with treating people however he wants?" "I'm sorry, but that's how things work around here. The appeal process exists, but it's designed to discourage people from using it. You'd need a lawyer, and most lawyers in this county won't go up against Judge Williamson because they have to appear in his court regularly." Rebecca left the clerk's office feeling more frustrated than ever. The system wasn't just broken, it was rigged to protect people like Judge Williamson while crushing regular citizens who couldn't fight back. That evening, she sat in her kitchen with a cup of tea, staring at the traffic ticket and the appeal paperwork. The fine was due in 30 days and the appeal would cost almost as much as the fine itself, with no guarantee of success. It felt like legal extortion. Her phone rang, and David's name appeared on the screen. "Hey," she answered, not bothering to hide the exhaustion in her voice. "Rebecca, you sound upset. What happened at the courthouse today?" She found herself pouring out the entire story. Judge Williamson's dismissive attitude, his refusal to examine evidence, the threats of contempt, and the clerk's warning about his reputation. David listened without interrupting, but she could hear something changing in his breathing as she talked. "This judge threatened you with arrest for trying to present evidence?" David's voice had an edge she rarely heard. "He was horrible, David. I've never been treated like that in my life, and apparently this is just how he operates. The clerk said people have complained before, but nothing happens because he has too many connections." There was a long pause on the other end of the line. "Rebecca," David said carefully. "What was this judge's name again?" "Williamson. Judge Harold Williamson. Why?" Another pause, longer this time. Rebecca could hear papers rustling in the background. I want you to do something for me, David said. Don't pay that fine yet. Don't file any appeals. Just wait. David, I only have 30 days to trust me on this. Don't do anything until I get back from Washington. Can you do that for me? There was something in her husband's voice that she'd never heard before. A kind of quiet authority that made her pay attention. Okay, she said slowly. But why? What can you possibly do from Washington about a small-town judge in Millbrook County? Just trust me, David repeated. I'll be home in 2 days and we'll handle this together. After they hung up, Rebecca sat in her kitchen, puzzled by her husband's reaction. David was a sweet, quiet man who worked in government administration. He'd always been supportive, but he wasn't exactly the type to take on corrupt judges. She couldn't imagine what he thought he could do that she hadn't already tried. What she didn't know was that at that very moment, 3,000 miles away in Washington, D.C., her husband was sitting in his chambers at the Supreme Court building, looking at a case file that had just taken on very personal significance. Justice David Chen had spent 15 years on the nation's highest court, handling cases that affected millions of people. But he'd never had a case quite like this one, where his own wife had been the victim of the kind of judicial misconduct he'd only read about in appeals. Judge Harold Williamson was about to learn that some people's spouses were more influential than others. Justice David Chen hung up the phone and stared out the window of his Supreme Court chambers at the Washington skyline. In all his years on the bench, he'd tried to keep his personal life completely separate from his professional duties. But what had happened to Rebecca wasn't just personal. It was exactly the kind of judicial misconduct that undermined the entire justice system he'd sworn to protect. He pulled up the court database on his computer and typed in Harold Williamson, Millbrook County. What he found made his jaw clench with anger. Judge Williamson had an unusually high rate of traffic conviction with minimal appeals, not because he was fair, but because people couldn't afford to fight him. The pattern was clear once you knew what to look for. David picked up his secure phone and dialed a number he rarely used. Federal Bureau of Investigation, Inspector Rodriguez speaking. Inspector, this is Justice Chen. I need to report potential judicial corruption and civil rights violations by a county judge. There was a pause. The FBI took calls from Supreme Court justices very seriously. Of course, Justice Chen, can you give me the details? David explained the situation carefully, focusing on the legal violations rather than his personal connection. A judge refusing to examine evidence, threatening citizens for attempting to defend themselves, and running a courtroom that denied due process. These were federal crimes, not just bad behavior. We'll open an investigation immediately, Inspector Rodriguez assured him. Cases involving judicial misconduct get priority treatment. Good. But Inspector, there's something else you should know. The victim in this particular incident is my wife. Another pause, this one longer. Justice Chen, are you sure you want to be involved in this investigation given your personal connection? I'm not asking to be involved in the investigation, David said firmly. I'm asking you to do your job. If a federal judge was abusing citizens, would my personal feelings change whether you investigated? No, sir, they wouldn't. Then treat this the same way. Judge Williamson violated my wife's constitutional rights. But more importantly, if he did it to her, he's doing it to other people who don't have anyone to call on their behalf. Meanwhile, back in Millbrook County, Rebecca was having trouble sleeping. She kept replaying the courthouse scene in her mind, feeling angry and helpless all over again. She'd never experienced anything like Judge Williamson's casual cruelty, and it shook her faith in institutions she'd always trusted. The next morning, she drove to work at Lincoln Elementary School, trying to focus on her third graders instead of her legal troubles. But during lunch break, her phone rang with a number she didn't recognize. Mrs. Chen, this is Inspector Rodriguez with the FBI. I'd like to speak with you about your recent experience in Judge Williamson's courtroom. Rebecca nearly drove. Abbott her sandwich. The FBI? I don't understand. We've received a complaint about potential civil rights violations involving Judge Williamson. Your case has been brought to our attention as part of an ongoing investigation. An ongoing investigation? But I just had my hearing yesterday. Yes, ma'am. Sometimes these investigations move quickly when there's clear evidence of constitutional violations. Would you be available to meet with me this afternoon to discuss what happened? Rebecca agreed to meet after school, her mind racing. She had no idea how the FBI had learned about her case so quickly, but she was grateful that someone was finally taking Judge Williamson's behavior seriously. That afternoon, Inspector Rodriguez turned out to be a professional woman in her 40s, who listened carefully as Rebecca recounted every detail of her courthouse experience. She took notes and asked specific questions about the judge's refusal to examine evidence and his threats of contempt. "Mrs. Chen, what you've described constitutes a clear violation of your right to due process," Inspector Rodriguez explained. "When a judge refuses to consider evidence and creates an atmosphere of intimidation to prevent defendants from presenting their case, that's a federal crime. I had no idea it was that serious. I thought judges could pretty much do whatever they wanted in their own courtrooms. That's a common misconception. Judges have broad discretion, but they can't violate constitutional rights. They can't deny due process, and they can't use their position to intimidate citizens." Inspector Rodriguez leaned forward. "Mrs. Chen, I need to ask you something important. Do you have any idea how this case came to federal attention so quickly?" Rebecca shook her head. "No, I never filed any federal complaints. I was still trying to figure out the local appeal process." The inspector nodded, making another note. "We'll be in touch as the investigation progresses. In the meantime, don't pay that fine. This case is now part of an active federal investigation." After Inspector Rodriguez left, Rebecca sat in her living room, more confused than ever. Federal investigations didn't just appear out of nowhere. Someone with serious influence had made this happen, but she couldn't imagine who or why. Her phone rang and David's name appeared on the screen. "Hey, how was your day?" he asked, his voice carefully neutral. "David, the strangest thing happened. An FBI inspector came to see me today about Judge Williamson. They're investigating him for civil rights violations." "Really? That's good news." Something in his tone made Rebecca pause. "David, do you know something about this? You told me not to pay the fine or file appeals. How did you know the FBI was going to get involved?" There was a long silence on the other end of the line. "Rebecca, I need to tell you something, but I need you to promise me you won't do anything with this information until I get home." "What kind of information?" "Promise me first." "Okay, I promise." "What's going on?" David took a deep breath. "My full name is David Chen, you know that. But what you might not have realized is that I'm Justice David Chen. I sit on the Supreme Court of the United States." Rebecca felt the world tilt around her. "What? David, that's not possible." "You work in government administration." "I do work in government administration. I administer justice at the highest level of our legal system. I've been a Supreme Court justice for 15 years, but you never told me." "How could you never tell me?" "Rebecca, I wanted you to live a normal life. I wanted our marriage to be about us, not about my job. Supreme Court justices and their families face constant security threats, media attention, and people trying to influence them. I wanted to protect you from all of that." Rebecca sank into her couch, trying to process this information. Her quiet, sweet husband who helped grade papers and fix the leaky faucet was one of the most powerful people in America. "So, when I told you about Judge Williamson, I called the FBI. What he did to you wasn't just wrong, Rebecca. It was a federal crime. He violated your constitutional rights, and I took an oath to defend the Constitution." "David, I don't know what to say. This is enormous. You're telling me you're literally a Supreme Court justice?" "I know it's a lot to process. But Rebecca, there's something else you need to understand. Once this gets out, and it will get out, our lives are going to change dramatically. The media attention alone will be intense, but I couldn't let what happened to you slide by." Rebecca thought about Judge Williamson's smug face, his dismissive attitude, his threats and intimidation. She thought about the clerk who'd warned her that nothing ever happened to judges with connections. What's going to happen to him? That's up to the FBI and the courts. But Rebecca, federal judges take judicial misconduct very seriously. If the investigation proves what we both know happened, Judge Williamson is going to face consequences he never imagined. As they talked, neither of them knew that at that very moment, Judge Williamson was in his chambers, completely unaware that his world was about to collapse. He was reviewing cases for the next day, probably planning to intimidate more citizens who couldn't fight back. He had no idea that one of those citizens was married to someone who could fight, back at the highest level of the American justice system. 2 days later, Judge Harold Williamson was enjoying his morning coffee in his chambers when his secretary knocked on the door with an unusually worried expression. "Judge Williamson?" There are some federal agents here to see you. They say it's urgent. Harold set down his coffee cup, annoyed at the interruption. Federal agents in Millbrook County usually meant drug cases or tax issues. Nothing that should concern him directly. Send them in, he said, straightening his tie and putting on his most authoritative expression. 2 FBI agents entered his chambers, Inspector Rodriguez and her partner, Agent Thompson. Both wore serious expressions that immediately put Harold on edge. Judge Williamson, Inspector Rodriguez said, showing her badge. I'm Inspector Rodriguez with the FBI. We need to speak with you about your conduct in recent court proceedings. Harold felt his stomach drop, but he kept his voice steady. I'm not sure what you mean. All of my court proceedings follow proper legal protocol. Specifically, Agent Thompson said, consulting his notes, we're investigating complaints about denial of due process and intimidation of defendants in your courtroom. That's absurd, Harold snapped, his face reddening. I run one of the most efficient courtrooms in this county. If someone is complaining, it's probably because they didn't like being held accountable for breaking the law. Inspector Rodriguez opened a folder. Judge Williamson, we have documented evidence of multiple constitutional violations, refusing to examine defendants' evidence, threatening citizens with arrest for attempting to present their defense, and creating an atmosphere of intimidation that prevents fair hearings. Harold's mind raced. Constitutional violations were serious business, the kind that could end careers and lead to federal charges. But he'd been operating this way for years without consequence. How had federal agents suddenly appeared in his courthouse? I want to speak with my lawyer, he said, trying to project confidence he didn't feel. That's your right, Inspector Rodriguez agreed. But Judge Williamson, you should know that this investigation has the full backing of federal authorities. We're not going away. After the agents left, Harold sat alone in his chambers, his hands shaking slightly as he reached for his phone. He called his lawyer, then the county administrator, then several political contacts who owed him favors. But everyone gave him the same message. Federal investigations were beyond their influence, and he was on his own. Meanwhile, across town, Rebecca was pacing her living room, waiting for David to come home. She'd spent 2 days processing the revelation that her husband was a Supreme Court justice, and she still couldn't quite believe it. Everything made sense now. His frequent travel to Washington, his deep knowledge of legal issues, his calm confidence in difficult situations. But she also felt hurt that he'd kept such a massive secret from her for so long. They'd been married for 8 years, and she'd never suspected the truth about his identity. When David's car pulled into the driveway, Rebecca watched from the window as he got out, looking every inch the quiet government administrator she'd always known him to be. But now she saw details she'd missed before. The way he carried himself, the expensive watch, the subtle confidence that came from wielding real power. Rebecca, he said as he walked through the door, immediately going to embrace her. I know this is a lot to process. She pulled back to look at him. 8 years, David. 8 years you let me think you worked some regular desk job in Washington. I wanted to protect you, he said softly. Do you know what happens to Supreme Court justices' families? They get death threats, constant media attention, people trying to use them to influence cases. I wanted you to have a normal life. But we're married. We're supposed to be partners. How could you make that decision for me? David sat down heavily on their couch. You're right. I should have told you. But Rebecca, once you know, there's no going back. Everything changes. Before Rebecca could respond, her phone rang. Inspector Rodriguez's name appeared on the screen. Mrs. Chen, I have an update on the investigation. Judge Williamson has been suspended pending a full federal review. We've also discovered evidence that your case wasn't isolated. There are at least a dozen other victims who've experienced similar treatment in his courtroom. Rebecca felt a surge of satisfaction mixed with vindication. What happens now? The investigation continues. We'll need your testimony for the formal proceedings. But Mrs. Chen, there's something else. This case is generating significant attention at high levels of government. Are you prepared for media scrutiny? Rebecca looked at David, who was listening to her side of the conversation. I think so. Someone needs to stand up to people like Judge Williamson. After she hung up, David reached for her hand. Rebecca, there's something I need to tell you. The media attention is going to be more intense than you realize. What do you mean? Judge Williamson doesn't know yet who you're married to. But when he finds out, and he will find out, this story is going to explode. Supreme Court Justice's wife mistreated by corrupt judge? That's front-page news for weeks. Rebecca felt her anxiety spike. I didn't ask for any of this attention. I know. But it's coming whether we want it or not. The question is, are you ready to see this through? Because once Judge Williamson learns the truth, he's going to try everything he can to discredit you and me. That evening, Judge Williamson was in his study at home, frantically researching federal investigation procedures and trying to figure out how his carefully controlled world had suddenly spiraled out of control. His lawyer had been blunt. If the FBI had enough evidence to suspend him, they probably had enough to file criminal charges. His phone rang and he saw it was Jerry Martinez, a reporter from the county newspaper who often covered court proceedings. Judge Williamson, I just heard about your suspension. Would you like to comment on the federal investigation? No comment, Harold said quickly, but Jerry continued talking. Judge, I've been digging into this story and I found something interesting. The complainant in the case that triggered this investigation is Rebecca Chen. She's married to Justice David Chen of the U.S. Supreme Court. Harold felt the blood drain from his face. The quiet little teacher he'd dismissed and threatened in his courtroom was married to one of the most powerful judges in America. Judge, are you still there? Harold hung up without responding, his mind reeling. No wonder the FBI had appeared so quickly. No wonder this investigation had federal backing. He'd threatened and humiliated the wife of a Supreme Court justice, treating her like some powerless citizen who couldn't fight back. He thought back to that day in court, Rebecca's attempts to present evidence, her insistence that she had proof of her innocence, her respectful but persistent efforts to defend herself. He'd crushed her simply because he could, because he enjoyed the power, because he'd never faced consequences for his behavior before. Now he understood why she'd seemed so confident that someone would listen to her story. She hadn't been some naive citizen hoping for fairness from a broken system. She'd been the wife of someone who could ensure the system worked the way it was supposed to. Harold poured himself a large whiskey and stared out his window at the quiet streets of Millbrook County. Tomorrow this story would be national news. His career was over, his reputation destroyed, and he was likely facing federal prison time because he'd chosen the wrong person to bully in his courtroom. The irony wasn't lost on him. He'd spent years using his position to intimidate people who couldn't fight back. Finally, he'd picked on someone who could fight back at the highest level of the American justice system. Justice, it seemed, had finally caught up with Judge Harold Williamson. The story broke on a Tuesday morning, 3 weeks after Rebecca's courthouse encounter. She woke up to find news vans parked outside her house and reporters camping on her lawn. Supreme Court Justice's wife targeted by corrupt judge read the headline on every major news website. The story had everything the media loved: power, corruption, justice, and an ordinary citizen standing up to a bully. David had prepared her for this, but seeing it happen was still overwhelming. Through their living room window, she watched reporters setting up cameras and practicing their introductions for live broadcasts. Rebecca, David said, bringing her a cup of coffee, we don't have to say anything to them. We can just wait for this to blow over. But Rebecca surprised him. No, I think I want to talk to them. Not about you, not about your job, but about what Judge Williamson did. Because I guarantee I'm not the only person he's treated that way. She was right. Within hours of the story breaking, Inspector Rodriguez called to tell them that 17 more people had come forward with similar experiences in Judge Williamson's courtroom. A pattern of abuse stretched back years. Single mothers threatened with jail time for questioning parking tickets, elderly citizens humiliated for requesting court-appointed attorneys, small business owners railroaded through proceedings without being allowed to present evidence. Rebecca decided to hold a press conference in front of the courthouse where Judge Williamson had treated her so badly. David stood beside her, not as a Supreme Court justice, but as a supportive husband. 3 weeks ago, I came to this courthouse as a law-abiding citizen trying to contest a traffic ticket, Rebecca told the gathered reporters. I had evidence that would have proven my innocence, but Judge Williamson refused to look at it. He threatened me with arrest for trying to defend myself. Her voice grew stronger as she continued. What happened to me wasn't about one traffic ticket. It was about a judge who abused his power because he thought I was just another person who couldn't fight back. But every person who walks into a courtroom deserves to be treated with dignity and respect, regardless of who they're married to or what connections they have. A reporter raised her hand. Mrs. Chen, did you know your husband was going to contact the FBI? I didn't even know my husband was a Supreme Court justice, Rebecca said, drawing surprised murmurs from the crowd. But when I told him what happened, he did what any decent person should do when they learn about injustice. He reported it to the proper authorities. Meanwhile, Judge Williamson was in his lawyer's office, watching the press conference on television with growing despair. His attorney, a sharp woman named Victoria Walsh, turned off the TV and faced him with brutal honesty. Harold, we need to talk about a plea deal. The FBI has testimony from 18 victims, recorded evidence of due process violations, and documentation of a pattern of abuse going back 7 years. If this goes to trial, you're looking at federal prison time. This is all because of one traffic ticket, Harold muttered. No, Victoria corrected him firmly. This is because you violated people's constitutional rights repeatedly, and you finally did it to someone who could hold you accountable. The federal charges against Judge Williamson were announced the following week. He faced multiple counts of deprivation of rights under color of law, a federal crime that carried serious prison time. The evidence was overwhelming. The FBI had found a pattern of behavior that showed clear intent to deny citizens their constitutional rights. But the consequences went beyond criminal charges. The State Judicial Commission launched their own investigation and suspended his law license. Local businesses began reviewing their relationships with his various enterprises. The county commissioners called for a full audit of his financial dealings. Most importantly for Rebecca, other victims found their voices. She received dozens of letters from people who'd been mistreated in Judge Williamson's courtroom, but had felt powerless to speak up. Many thanked her for giving them hope that the system could work when people stood up for what was right. 3 months later, Rebecca found herself in a very different courtroom in the state capitol. Judge Williamson's criminal trial was making national headlines, but today was about something simpler. Her original traffic ticket case. Judge Patricia Collins, who was overseeing the review of all cases from Judge Williamson's court, looked over Rebecca's evidence with the care and attention it deserved from the beginning. Mrs. Chen, Judge Collins said after examining the speed data, photographs, and documentation, it's clear that you were not speeding on the day in question. This citation is dismissed and the county will refund any fees you paid. It was a small victory, but it felt enormous to Rebecca. She'd finally received the fair hearing she deserved. Outside the courthouse, David was waiting for her with a smile that reminded her why she'd fallen in love with him in the first place. How does it feel to finally win your traffic ticket case? He asked. It feels like justice, she said, then paused. David, I've been thinking about something. I understand why you kept your job secret, but I don't want to live that way anymore. I don't want to hide who we are or worry about what people might think. David nodded. You're right. I was so focused on protecting you that I forgot you might want to be part of this life instead of being protected from it. I'm not saying I want to be a political wife or anything like that, Rebecca clarified. But I want to be your partner, not someone you need to shield from your real life. 6 months later, Judge Harold Williamson was sentenced to 3 years in federal prison and permanent disbarment from practicing law. In his sentencing hearing, he offered a public apology that felt too little, too late for most people who'd followed the case. But Rebecca attended the hearing anyway. When reporters asked her why, she gave a simple answer. I wanted to sit. That the system worked, that someone who abused their power faced real consequences. The ripple effects of the case extended far beyond one corrupt judge. The state implemented new oversight procedures for judicial conduct, created easier paths for citizens to report abuse, and established mandatory training on constitutional rights for all judges. Rebecca returned to teaching, but she also began volunteering with legal aid organizations, helping other ordinary citizens navigate the justice system. She learned that standing up to power was scary, but possible when people supported each other. David continued his work on the Supreme Court, but their relationship had changed for the better. Rebecca now understood the weight of his responsibilities, and he'd learned to trust her strength instead of trying to protect her from the world. Sometimes in the evenings, They'd sit on their porch and talk about the day David had asked her to trust him and wait before paying that traffic ticket. It seemed like such a small moment, but it had changed everything. "Do you ever regret it?" David asked one evening. "All the media attention, the disruption to your life." Rebecca thought about Judge Williamson's other victims, the people who'd written to thank her, the changes in the judicial system that had resulted from her willingness to fight back. "No," she said. "I learned something important. Justice doesn't just happen automatically. Sometimes ordinary people have to stand up and demand it. I just got lucky that I had someone who knew how to make the system listen." But deep down, Rebecca knew it hadn't been luck. It had been the simple truth that in America, even the most powerful people are supposed to be held accountable when they abuse their authority. It had just taken the right person at the right time to make that principle real, Judge. Williamson had learned the hard way that no one is above the law, not even judges who think they can intimidate citizens who have nowhere to turn for help. Sometimes, those citizens turn out to have somewhere to turn after all.